Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chatting the Pictures. My name is Kara Finnegan. I'm a writer, teacher, and historian of photography.
And I'm Michael Shaw, publisher of Reading the Pictures.
So we're back, Michael, and we have, as usual, a nice group of photographs to talk about. Do you want to talk about kind of what we're going to approach, how we're going to approach things today?
Yeah, we've sort of got ourselves, we got into the hood and have, like taken a little bit different approach to things on the program. We have a different format, and we're going to be looking at pictures in terms of different categories, and you'll see how it unfolds as we go. But we're excited to, take a little bit different tact on the program.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun to sort through. So why don't I talk about our first segment, if you will, and we're calling this segment the news. And here we're really asking two fundamental questions. How do news photos tell a story? And how do we really understand the information that we find in a news photo? So let's take a look at the photo we've chosen for this segment today. Michael, do you want to give us a caption?
The caption reads, "Police and protesters surround the toppled statue of a Confederate soldier nicknamed Silent Sam at the University of North Carolina campus after a demonstration for its removal in Chapel Hill, North Carolina," and it is a photo taken by Reuters.
And yeah, so when we think about visual information, there's a lot happening literally and figuratively in this photo for sure.
Definitely. In terms of a little bit of background, it was commissioned by the Daughters of the Confederacy. It was erected in 1913. There was very much a white supremacist theme to the unveiling. There's been a lot of protests about surrounding the statue since the 60s, even more so since 2015 when it was vandalized. The university's made many efforts to remove the statue, but the state lawmakers have said that they can't. They're prohibited by state law. So I guess just to say one thing about in terms of our theme, why is this a good news photo? And one thing struck me is that it shows the aftermath instead of the act. So as opposed to an act of passion, I think that the image, especially because it's loaded with symbolism, really asks us to consider the consequences of what happened, as much as just angry students tearing this down.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but you do have it's like the whole story is condensed in a way here, because you see. Again, you see the aftermath, you see the statues down. There is dirt that some of the protesters dumped on the statue. The statue itself is obviously off its pedestal. The stairs have what I think is simulated blood or paint on them. And then, of course, the presence of law enforcement, and then the students and, this crowd. So you get the sense, right, that something has happened. And it's also interesting to me the way like the visual composition plays with that element of what makes this a good news photo, because the statue itself takes up so much space in the photo. It is literally fallen off its foundation. It's on the ground. The photographer chose to take the photo from above, which I think partly, I'm sure, was logistical, because when you're covering a news event, you literally have to get above the fray to be able to see things, right? But that also suggests, that looking down, and several people are looking down at the statue, that also suggests, maybe a kind of moving aside, kicking away.
Judgment.
Judging, eliminating something from the past, moving on. So there's all of that playing out too, in a way that I think is interesting. It also occurs to me that, and in looking at some of the other photos surrounding this event, this is also, it's definitely student-aged crowd for the most part, with the exception of the law enforcement, right, who are clearly kind of encircling the statue. But it's also a very diverse crowd. So it seems, in terms of racial and ethnic diversity, I think in particular, when you can determine the visual markers of that, and I think that also highlights the way this captures the news, which is that this is, marking an event that attracted a diverse group of students who do not want this statue on their campus anymore.
Yeah, in fact, they're mostly white students, and it looks like they're really witnessing more than anything else. And so, like I said before, it's really like the opposite of a mob, and that's a nice counterpoint to almost how much hysteria and polarization we have in the news and in the country and in the news these days. But even more so, it feels like, and maybe it's a bit of a stretch, but it feels a little bit like a teaching moment in terms of the observation going on.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And in some ways, I think that kind of implicates us too, doesn't it? Because as the viewer, we are, if the crowd is encircling the statue and we're in the position of the photographer, we're a part of that witnessing as well. And so, there are a couple of people in the crowd who are looking right at the photographer, therefore right at us. And that, implies that we have a role to play too. This is definitely a photo where you're put into a scene and a scenario, as opposed to being positioned as a more, you might say, passive observer. And I think that's another way to think about the way this photo tells a story as a news photo.
In terms of the reaction, what was interesting is that the two major newspapers in North Carolina both were approving of what happened, but I guess predictably there was a lot of anger and backlash from legislators, and some of the anger was directed toward campus police, like they knew and they were, or the security, and they let that happen. So there is a sort of it's hard to know exactly what the role is or the tone or attitude of the state, of the police in the photograph also, which I think is good. And then the amazing touch there is the African American policewoman. It's so ironic, and it's even more so because there was a very famous quote from a soldier at the unveiling of the statue, and has been repeated often in a lot of the protests. And there was just like a key line was where he said, "I horsewhipped a Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds less than 100 yards from here." So that makes the photo like particularly ironic if you know a little bit more of the background.
Yeah, and I think that that anecdote, I guess, I don't know, that story, I guess, from the unveiling of the statue points to, that's been brought up to say, look, this is not, just honoring the Confederate dead or the Confederate soldier, right? This is about a whole other series of things. And there's I think a nice visual punctuation behind that police officer that you were just describing to the man in red behind her, and then the diagonally toward you in the front, the red there too, right? And she sort of bisected that. So it is,
That's nice. I didn't see that.
It's a photo that I think, again, does what a news photo does really well, or can do really well, which is encapsulate all of these competing narratives and stories and still give you a picture of what happened in the moment. Shall we move on to our next segment?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we are calling this next segment The Look. And what do we mean by the look? We're doing looking all the time, right? Here we're really interested in, how are news photos making the best use of artistry and style? How might they be pushing the visual boundaries to illuminate a story or an idea? And, every time we talk about a group of images, there's usually one photo we found where we end up really spending some time with the look, if you will, of a photo. And so here is this week's The Look.
So this photo was taken by Michael Robinson Chavez of the Washington Post. He's a great photographer. The caption reads, "In downtown Charlottesville, state police vehicles are reflected in a window displaying advertising for Spike Lee's new film, BlacKkKlansman." And just a little bit of context in terms of how we might be seeing more artistic news photos. This photo appeared in a 26-photo Washington Post slideshow that was titled "The Scene in Charlottesville a Year After the Deadly Racial Violence." So, and Chavez also had it on his Instagram feed. But what's great is that this photo was taken on the same weekend as the anniversary of the uprising last year in Charlottesville, and there was protests scheduled for the day. So the photo is very laden just from that standpoint.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you mentioned kind of that whole other sequence of photos, because one of the things that's interesting if you look through that whole edit is, and one of the I think things that came out in the news coverage of the anniversary was the really tremendous police presence, and a lot of folks in Charlottesville who were marching to commemorate the events of last year, who were marching for peace, who were remembering their participation in the anti-white supremacist activity last year. A lot of them were not happy with the extent to which the police were everywhere. And I think Chavez's photos chronicle that. And so this image, as an image from that same event, I think visually, really creatively encapsulates that combination of lawlessness and the law in the context of the images of the state patrol cars reflected in the window, and serves as a kind of almost a cover photo or a punctuation point on, I think, the ideas or the events of the commemoration itself. It's really ghostly, isn't it? I mean, that sense, you, Michael, you wrote a little bit about this photo on Instagram in the context of the way reflections are playing out here.
Yeah, and I've been spending a lot of time on Instagram these days because I think that's where, you have the highest level of artistry by, the Washington Press Corps. And, windows and mirrors are playing a very large role in photography these days. And not only that, but also street photography. And so what Michael has done, maybe, by virtue of also having all this real estate, in a slideshow, is to move in that very artistic direction. And so it creates this really unique and surprising and sophisticated image, which I guess you could say almost like infiltrates the imagination. Mm-hmm. But mm-hmm. what we're doing, the movie is about this a historical look at a black and white policeman who infiltrated the Klan, and the photo is superimposed on Charlottesville now. I mean, so you're talking about how the photograph blends past and present. It mirrors the past, especially with the police car. And then the way it blends art and politics is really fascinating also, because, so much of what's desensitized us to the news and the images of the news these days is how much it has been turned into theater or performance. So in some way, what's so sophisticated about this, but also so simple, is how he takes that and uses it to allow us to have a fresher and more immediate perception of what's happening now, and also how it repeats the past, and makes it very alive.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why that works, that kind of merging of the past and the present, and again, it's that ghostly reflection, that kind of semi-transparency of the Klan hood with the background of the city, is that there's just like a random guy walking down what looks like a pretty safe street, because gee, look at all of those law enforcement vehicles there. Nothing dramatic seems to be happening, and yet you have this ghostly, very visually confrontational, because the figure's looking right at you, this image, and then this message. And so, yeah, I mean, this is such a great choice to talk about the look, because that's exactly what Chavez is doing. Is he's pushing the boundaries of our vision in a really literal way, because you see this image, and especially in a Washington Post slideshow, where you're kind of clicking through to see what the news photos are. Boom, like, wait, what is this? It's very destabilizing. It's really conceptual, it's allegorical. It forces you to try to figure out what this is, just in a really concrete sense. But then, of course, it does all of these other things at the same time, like you said. I mean, it's laden with this really complicated, smart symbolism that's communicated just masterfully visually. It's such an interesting photo.
Totally.
Shall we move on to our next and final segment of the episode? And this is something we are calling the pick. So the photos that we're thinking about for this segment, what we're really doing is we're trying to think a little bit about editorial choices. What makes a photo a good editorial choice, given that editors have lots and lots and lots of options, right? So, and then not just editors, but what are images that get public traction, that seem to take on a life of their own, maybe on Instagram or in social media in general, or in the news more broadly. So here is this week's The Pick.
Yeah, I love this photograph for a number of reasons. I'm a big fan of Gabriela Dumchek, who shoots for the New York Times. So this is one of hers. The caption reads, "President Trump in Charleston, West Virginia for a rally on Tuesday, hours after judgments against two of his former confidants came out." And wow, I mean, I think this is actually a very bold choice. And I think I'm so glad we're doing this segment too, because it really is a way to honor editors, because I think that they're like unsung heroes of visual media, especially these days. But there were so many choices, so many photographs that the Times could have used on their at least online homepage, where this ran, or a variant of it ran. And you could have seen Michael Cohen, and there was portraits of Paul Manafort. There was even funky court illustrations that were kind of retro that they could have used because photo cameras weren't allowed in the courthouse. But they chose this, and it's really cinematic also. And maybe thinking about the last picture we saw, maybe there's something of a trend there in terms of aesthetics. But and then there's also like the really obvious stuff, which we see Trump so small, so tiny, that the consequence of these two figures now being indicted or found guilty, really shows the photograph leveraging Trump's narcissism. So those are a couple of thoughts I had. I got some other ideas, but I was kind of interested in what struck you about this, Karen.
Yeah, and what's really interesting, and again, I think you're right that one of the things about doing a segment called The Pick is that we are really inviting closer attention to those choices. Why this photo and not others? And this is always a question, I think, that people like you and me are interested in. And this is again the editor's art. Here, I think in addition to what you said, the photo is moody. Trump had a bad day. He had a very bad day. And you've got the looming kind of dark looking sky. Things do not look bright and sunny as he is, I don't know if this was coming off the plane or boarding the plane. I think he might be turning to go up the stairs. We'll see when we look at another possible pick in a moment. But it's, again, very dark,
It's got him
you
coming and
know,
going.
yeah, and it's one of these things where, when I first thought, I thought, oh, that's brilliant. And then I had a moment and I thought, is that a little too easy? And then I thought, no, that's brilliant. Because this is the kind of photo that, again, unless you have a context, unless you have a frame for thinking about, why this photo on this day, it's a perfect match. And so that's what makes it, to me, a great pick, because it is, what makes it a great pick for the page and for the screen is it's got all of these fabulous visual components, and it is a perfect, again, kind of symbolic illustration of a story that, is not that sexy visually. You just sort of put mugshots or headshots of people who keep getting indicted or pleading guilty or whatever. Right. Guys in suits aren't really that thrilling, even if they're the president. And so to me, I think this photo is a great pick.
Right, they really have taken that jump into art, and there's other things going on here that, and not being like an art historian or not being an art theorist, you're an art critic, it's like I'm just guessing at, but it has that kind of Escher, the double read, so there's the, you can see this two ways, but so and to me it also has a feeling a little bit like of a guillotine. Or like that it's about to be, because there's something kinetic about this to me in a way. I don't know if it's the movement of the sky kind of invites you to go there, but it feels like this, thing can be actually dropping down and crunching him, rock and hard place. And then the other thing that I thought was really interesting too is that, and I don't know, I always get busted for like, stretching too far in terms of symbolism, but the Air Force One wing, and I was thinking, that it made me think like the instruments or the devices of power that Trump's been exploiting are now turning against him. It's like it's the plane that creates this foreboding. So, nothing's working for him there.
Yeah. And, as you were talking too, I was also thinking about, if you think of this whole scene as dark, and then there's a spotlight coming down from, that light of the sky, that triangle created by, the framing could be a spotlight, and it's shining down on only Trump. And it's it's a foreboding kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of thinking about the pick, why don't we look at what another option was in this case that the New York Times also did in fact use. So different Trump bodily, same location, same general framing, right? But a different pick.
Really quickly, the photo we saw before ran on the homepage of the New York Times yesterday morning after, the morning after all this news came out. And then the photo we saw before also leads the news story that's still on the Times homepage. But then this showed up when I went to their homepage. And took a screen grab of it because they just went with a variant, and so it's really fascinating. Like I don't know how you interpret the wave. What's crazy for me is that the first thing that struck me when I saw this was Nixon's, like goodbye, on the helicopter leaving, and so maybe that's like wish fulfillment or something. But it really was like the sign off to me in a way, But I don't know.
I think that's exactly what I saw too. When I first saw that, I thought, oh my gosh, yes, it's this echo, right? And it's that sense of like, I can't think of the right phrase, but it's like, dancing into hell or something, or, like putting on the face when everything's going south. It might be wish fulfillment perhaps as well. There is a kind of vulnerability to his body, though. I mean, even though he seems in command because he's waving, there is a bit of more vulnerability in the sense that his body is open toward you. You've still got this looming sky behind, and so at first when I saw this, I thought, oh, this is totally the opposite of the other image. And then I thought, well, I don't think it's exactly the opposite. It's doing something different. Maybe, again, tapping into a different visual memory on our parts.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's hard to look at it, though. I mean, the guy's such an abomination. I think you can say that no matter what, almost anywhere you are in the political spectrum outside of the like 20% at this point. But you can't look at this without it being like so ironic. But in a way, it's sort of like, if he did quit or he gets forced out or whatever happens, he's still going to delude himself to think that he was wonderful. And so you have this sort of Mr. Rogers kind of vibe to this. I was great. It was great. I'll see you later. And then like, who was that guy? It's so much like his fantasy, even if he gets crunched and destroys everything,
Yeah. Well, and in this version too, I'm going to click back to the earlier one. This one, he sort of seems to know the score. And in this one, he seems oblivious to what's coming behind him. And again, this may be a lot more, interpreting images is often as much about the interpreter as anything else. But I do think these are great examples to talk about that idea of the pick, right? Because they and clearly they knew they had some great images from Dumchik, and like let's use them all.
Yeah, and they can.
And then also the headline.
You can do that.
Yeah, and I think pairing the headline here with that sense of vulnerability, that's an interesting choice too, because that sense of the openness of the body, maybe not being aware of what's behind him, that might be ticking off or playing off of the headline a little bit in terms of the way I interpreted the image.
Yeah, it's sort of like Jaws.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, credit to the New York Times for, they're doing really wonderful work with their photography and giving people a lot of license and choosing and hiring new people that are really talented and a more diverse and younger team of photographers. So all good. Yeah.
So Michael, you want to wrap us up? I think people can let us know what they think about the segments. I think we're going to have some fun with them. We're still playing with them, but they seem to kind of get at some of the things that we like to talk about with photos, but that maybe are distinct in terms of like warranting their own more substantive conversation around just one image.
Yeah, the news, the look, the pick, we're going to stick with it and see how it goes. And we're just excited to do this every week and to share some of our thoughts and really good photography, especially in these very fraught days. So we encourage you to keep watching us, and we'll be posting these on social media, on our website, and join us again next week.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.